The August sun beat down on Trinity, New Mexico territory, with such fierce intensity that the very air seemed to shimmer and dance above the dusty Main Street. And Beatrice Calloway stood in the middle of it all, swaying slightly as black spots began to crowd the edges of her vision. She had been traveling for 3 days straight from St. Louis, first by train and then by stagecoach, to reach this God-forsaken corner of the territory where her uncle claimed to have established a profitable mercantile business. The year was 1885, and proper young women did not typically venture west alone. But Beatrice had little choice after her father's death left her with mounting debts, and a stepmother who made it abundantly clear she was no longer welcome in the only home she had ever known. The letter from Uncle Herbert had arrived at precisely the right moment, offering her employment and lodging in exchange for helping him manage his store's accounts and correspondence. The stagecoach had deposited her in front of the Trinity Hotel just moments ago, and the driver had already disappeared with her trunk, leaving her standing alone with her carpetbag clutched in one gloved hand. The heat was unlike anything she had experienced in Missouri. It pressed down on her like a physical weight, made worse by the layers of proper traveling clothes she wore. A high-necked navy dress with long sleeves, a corset cinched tight beneath, petticoats, and a matching jacket that had seemed appropriate when she left the relative coolness of the morning departure point, but now felt like a furnace against her skin. Beatrice tried to take a step toward the hotel's entrance, but her legs refused to cooperate. The black spots multiplied, merging together until they nearly obscured her vision entirely. She felt herself tilting sideways, the world spinning in a nauseating whirl of brown earth and bleached sky. Her fingers loosened on the carpetbag handle. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was the strange sensation of falling, followed immediately by strong arms catching her before she could hit the ground. James Tucker had been leading his horse to the water trough outside the saloon when he saw the woman in the dark traveling dress begin to sway. He recognized the signs immediately, having seen more than one person succumb to the brutal New Mexico heat, and he dropped his horse's reins without a second thought and sprinted across the street. He reached her just as her knees buckled, catching her solidly against his chest as her full weight collapsed into his arms. "Damn fool woman," he muttered, but there was no real heat in his words, only concern. She was dressed like she was attending a winter social in Boston, not arriving in one of the hottest towns in the territory during the worst month of summer. Her face, what he could see of it beneath the small hat pinned to her dark hair, had gone pale as milk, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. James shifted her weight in his arms, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her shoulders, and carried her swiftly toward the narrow alley beside the hotel, where a patch of shade offered some relief from the relentless sun. A few curious onlookers had stopped to stare, but James ignored them, focused entirely on getting the unconscious woman out of the heat. The shade was only marginally cooler, but it was better than nothing. James knelt and laid her gently on the ground, propping her head on his folded jacket. He pulled off her small hat, releasing pins that had held it secure, and began working at the buttons of her high collar with fingers made clumsy by urgency and the impropriety of what he was doing. Propriety be damned, he thought. The woman would cook alive in these clothes. "Someone get Doc Harrison," he called over his shoulder, and he heard footsteps running off to comply. James got the top 3 buttons undone, enough to loosen the strangling collar from her throat, and then he stood and strode quickly to the water trough, soaking his bandana in the tepid water before returning to kneel beside her again. He pressed the wet cloth to her forehead, her temples, the back of her neck where dark hair had been pinned up in an elaborate style. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably not much past 20, with fine features and dark lashes that rested against her pale cheeks. There was something delicate about her, something that spoke of city life and sheltered upbringings, and he wondered what circumstances had brought her to Trinity alone. Her eyelids fluttered, and then she was looking up at him with startled eyes the color of honey in sunlight. For a moment she seemed confused, disoriented, and then awareness flooded back and she tried to sit up abruptly. "Easy," James said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder to keep her down. "You fainted. Just lie still for a minute." "I never faint," Beatrice said, which was true. She prided herself on her practical nature and strong constitution, but even as she said it, a wave of dizziness washed over her, proving her words false. She became suddenly, mortifyingly aware that she was lying on the ground in an alley with a strange man leaning over her, and that her collar was undone. Her hands flew to her throat. "What did you do? Kept you from suffocating in that getup," James replied, rocking back on his heels. "You are dressed for a blizzard, not the New Mexico desert in August." Beatrice felt heat flood her cheeks, and she knew it had nothing to do with the weather. "I did not expect it to be quite so warm." "Warm?" James actually laughed at that, a short bark of amusement. "Lady, it is 105 degrees today, and that is in the shade. This is not warm. This is what hell feels like when the devil stokes the fires." Before Beatrice could respond, an older man with white whiskers and a black medical bag hurried into the alley, slightly out of breath. "What have we got here, James?" "Heat exhaustion, I think. She just got off the stage." Doc Harrison knelt beside Beatrice and began his examination, checking her pulse and looking into her eyes. "Can you tell me your name, Miss Beatrice Calloway? And I assure you I am perfectly fine now. I simply stood in the sun too long after a tiring journey." "You are lucky Mr. Tucker here has quick reflexes," the doctor said. "A blow to the head on top of heat exhaustion would have been serious. You need to get out of these clothes, drink plenty of water, and stay out of the sun for the rest of the day." "Where are you staying?" "The hotel, I suppose. I am here to see my uncle, Herbert Calloway. He owns the Mercantile." The doctor and James exchanged a look that Beatrice could not quite interpret. "Well," the doctor said carefully, "let us get you to the hotel and settled, and then we can send word to your uncle." James helped Beatrice to her feet, and she was embarrassed to find that she still needed his steadying hand on her elbow. The world tilted dangerously for a moment before righting itself. She became aware that James Tucker was tall, probably 6 feet or more, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His eyes were a striking pale blue, startling against his tanned face, and there was a quiet competence about him that inspired confidence. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "You saved me from a nasty fall. All in a day's work, Miss Calloway." But he smiled as he said it, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and Beatrice felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with heat exhaustion. They made their way slowly to the hotel entrance, where the proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Hendricks, took immediate charge. She clucked over Beatrice like a worried hen, ushering her inside where it was marginally cooler, and sent her husband to retrieve Beatrice's trunk. James lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching to make sure she was in good hands before he left. "You should come by the ranch once you are settled," he said, and Beatrice looked at him in surprise. "The Tucker Ranch, about 5 miles south of town. Your uncle will know where it is. We do business with his store regularly." "Why would I come to your ranch, Mr. Tucker?" "Because I figure you will want to thank me properly once you are feeling better," he said, and there was a teasing glint in his eyes now. Maybe you could bake me a pie or something." City ladies are always baking pies, right? Beatrice found herself smiling despite her exhaustion and embarrassment. "I have never baked a pie in my life, Mr. Tucker, but I suppose I could learn if that is the customary way to thank someone for their heroic rescue." Heroic, was it? James grinned. "I just caught you, Miss Calloway. Any decent man would have done the same." "Nevertheless, I am grateful." James nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and touched the brim in a small salute before turning to leave. Beatrice watched him go, noting the confident way he moved, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his work shirt, and she felt that flutter again, stronger this time. Mrs. Hendricks appeared at her elbow with a glass of water. "Drink this, dear, all of it. And then we will get you upstairs and out of those awful clothes. What were you thinking, traveling in wool?" "I was thinking I needed to look respectable when I arrived," Beatrice said. But she drank the water obediently, draining the glass in long gulps that would have horrified her former etiquette teacher. The hotel room was small but clean, with a single window that looked out over the main street. Mrs. Hendricks helped Beatrice out of her jacket and dress, unlaced her corset, and left her in just her chemise and a single petticoat. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Beatrice sank onto the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, and closed her eyes. "You rest now, Mrs. Hendricks said. "I will send someone to fetch your uncle and let him know you have arrived." "Thank you. You are very kind." After Mrs. Hendricks left, Beatrice lay in the quiet room and tried to process everything that had happened. She had been in Trinity less than an hour and had already made a spectacle of herself by fainting in the middle of the street. She had been undressed by a stranger, examined by a doctor, and rescued by a cowboy whose blue eyes she could not seem to stop thinking about. This was not at all how she had imagined her arrival in the New Mexico territory would go. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, there was a sharp knock on her door and a voice she vaguely recognized from childhood memories calling her name. "Beatrice, are you in there?" She sat up, still feeling slightly dizzy, and called back, "Come in, Uncle Herbert." The door opened, and a man entered who bore little resemblance to the uncle she remembered from a single visit to St. Louis when she was 12. He had been robust then, full of energy and big plans. The man who stood before her now was thin to the point of gauntness, with gray hair and tired eyes. But his smile was warm and genuine as he crossed the room and took her hands in his. "My dear girl, I am so sorry. I should have warned you about the heat. I have grown so accustomed to it that I forget how brutal it can be for newcomers. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you. I am embarrassed by the whole affair." "Nonsense. It happens to everyone their first summer here. I fainted dead away my second day in Trinity, right in the middle of conducting a sale. At least you had James Tucker to catch you. He is a good man, one of the best in the territory." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm at the mention of James's name. "He was very kind. Is he truly a rancher?" "One of the most successful in the county. His father built up the Tucker Ranch from nothing, and James has expanded it considerably since taking over 5 years ago. He runs cattle, some horses, and he is always fair in his dealings. You could do worse than to have him as a friend in these parts." There was something knowing in her uncle's eyes that made Beatrice change the subject quickly. "I am eager to see the mercantile and learn the business." Herbert's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Yes, well, we will have plenty of time to discuss that tomorrow. For now, you need to focus on recovering. Doc Harrison says you are to stay out of the sun and drink water regularly. The heat is nothing to trifle with, Beatrice. People have died from it. I will be more careful, I promise." Her uncle stayed for a while longer, filling her in on the basics of life in Trinity. The town had been established about 15 years earlier as a trading post and had grown steadily as ranchers and farmers settled the surrounding area. It had the usual amenities: a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a school, a doctor's office, a blacksmith, and of course, the Calloway Mercantile. The nearest city of any real size was Santa Fe, about 80 miles north. After Herbert left, Beatrice forced herself to drink more water and pick at the tray of food Mrs. Hendricks brought up. She was not particularly hungry, but she knew she needed to eat to rebuild her strength. As evening fell and the temperature finally began to drop, she moved to the window and looked out at the main street below. Trinity was coming alive now that the worst heat of the day had passed. People emerged from buildings, horses and wagons moved up and down the street, and lamplight began to glow in windows. It was so different from St. Louis, so much smaller and rougher, but there was something honest about it that appealed to her. There was no pretense here, no society matrons to impress or complicated social rules to navigate. Just honest work and honest living. Her thoughts drifted to James Tucker, as they had several times since their encounter. She wondered what his ranch looked like, whether he lived there alone or with family, what his story was. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You are here to work and build a new life, not to moon over the first handsome man who crosses your path." But even as she thought it, she knew she was hoping to see him again soon. The next morning, Beatrice woke early and dressed carefully in the lightest dress she owned, a simple cotton day dress in pale yellow. She left off one petticoat and loosened her corset as much as propriety would allow. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face had a touch of color from yesterday's sun exposure, making her honey-colored eyes seem brighter, and there was something different in her expression, something more determined and alive than she had seen in months. Uncle Herbert collected her after breakfast and walked her the short distance to the Mercantile. The store was larger than Beatrice had expected, taking up a corner lot with big windows displaying everything from farm tools to bolts of fabric. Inside, it was dim and relatively cool, packed from floor to ceiling with goods of every description. There was a counter along one side where transactions took place, and a small office in the back where Herbert kept his records. "I will not deceive you, Beatrice," Herbert said as he showed her around. "The business is struggling. I made some poor investments last year and I am behind on several accounts. I need someone with a head for figures to help me sort out the mess and get things back on track. Your father always said you were brilliant with numbers." Beatrice felt a pang at the mention of her father. "I will do my best to help, Uncle Herbert. May I see the books?" They spent the rest of the morning going over the accounts, and Beatrice quickly saw the extent of the problem. Her uncle had extended too much credit to customers who were slow to pay, had overstocked items that were not selling, and had failed to collect on several significant debts. It was not an insurmountable problem, but it would require careful management and some difficult conversations. "We need to institute a stricter credit policy," Beatrice said, making notes on a piece of paper. "And we should consider a sale to move some of this excess inventory. We are paying to store goods that are just gathering dust." Herbert looked relieved. "I knew you would see what needed to be done. I am afraid I let things get away from me after my wife passed 2 years ago. I lost heart for a while." "I am sorry, Uncle Herbert. I did not know about your wife. We were not married long, only 5 years, but she was everything to me. This country can be hard on women, Beatrice. The isolation, the heat, the difficulty of life here. Are you sure you want to stay?" Beatrice thought about it seriously before answering. "I have nowhere else to go, Uncle Herbert. My stepmother made it clear I was unwelcome, and without a dowry or connections, My prospects in St. Louis were dim at best. At least here I can work and make myself useful. At least here I can build something. Herbert patted her hand. Then we will build something together. They were interrupted by the bell above the door chiming, and Beatrice looked up to see James Tucker entering the store. He was dressed for work in dusty trousers, a faded blue shirt, and worn leather chaps, his hat pushed back on his head. He looked every inch the working rancher, and Beatrice felt her heart give that treacherous flutter again. "Morning, Herbert," James said. Then his eyes found Beatrice and his expression brightened. "Miss Calloway, I am glad to see you up and about. You look much better than you did yesterday." "I feel much better, thank you, and please call me Beatrice. I think we can dispense with formality given the circumstances of our meeting." "Then you should call me James." He turned to Herbert. "I need to place an order for supplies. We are repairing the east pasture fence, and I am running low on wire and posts." Herbert gestured to Beatrice. "My niece will be handling orders from now on. Beatrice, why don't you help Mr. Tucker while I finish unpacking that shipment in the back?" Beatrice shot her uncle a look that suggested she knew exactly what he was doing, but she moved behind the counter and picked up a pencil and order form. "What do you need, James?" They spent the next 20 minutes going over his supply needs, and Beatrice found herself enjoying the process more than she expected. James was clear and specific about what he wanted, and he asked intelligent questions about pricing and delivery times. He treated her as a competent businesswoman, not as a delicate lady to be humored, and she appreciated that. "You pick things up quick," James observed as she totaled his order with swift, accurate calculations. "Most people take weeks to learn Herbert's system. Numbers make sense to me. They follow rules and behave predictably, unlike most other things in life." True enough, though life would be pretty dull if everything was predictable. Beatrice looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I suppose that is one way to look at it. Have you had a chance to see any of the territory yet, or have you been stuck inside since the fainting incident?" "I have been inside," Beatrice admitted. "Uncle Herbert says I should stay out of the sun for a few more days. That is probably wise. But once you are cleared to venture out, I would be happy to show you around. The country out here is harsh, but it has its own kind of beauty once you learn to see it." "I would like that," Beatrice said, and she meant it. "Though I am afraid I do not ride. We have a gentle mare that would be perfect for a beginner. I could teach you, if you are willing to learn." "Are you always this helpful to women you barely know, or am I special?" James grinned. "You are definitely special, Beatrice. Not many city ladies would stand in that heat until they dropped rather than admit they needed help. That takes a special kind of stubborn. I prefer to think of it as determined." "Stubborn," James repeated, but his eyes were warm with amusement. "I will be back in 3 days to pick up this order. Maybe by then Doc Harrison will have cleared you for outdoor activities." After James left, Beatrice tried to focus on the account books, but her mind kept wandering to the conversation they had just had. There was something about James Tucker that drew her, something beyond his obvious physical appeal. He was confident without being arrogant, strong without being domineering, and he seemed to see her as a person rather than just a pretty face or a burden to be managed. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Beatrice spent her mornings and afternoons at the mercantile, learning the business and slowly bringing order to her uncle's chaotic bookkeeping. She proved to have a natural talent for it, quickly identifying problems and implementing solutions. She renegotiated terms with suppliers, instituted a sale that moved excess inventory, and began the delicate work of collecting on overdue accounts. The heat remained brutal, but Beatrice adapted. She learned to move slowly during the hottest part of the day, to drink water constantly, to wear the lightest clothing propriety would allow. She began taking her meals at the hotel dining room, where she met other residents of Trinity, and slowly began to feel less like an outsider. The women of the town were initially suspicious of this educated city lady, but Beatrice's practical nature and willingness to work hard gradually won them over. James came by the mercantile regularly, always with some excuse about needing supplies or checking on an order, but Beatrice suspected the visits were more about seeing her than conducting business. They fell into easy conversations, talking about everything from literature to politics to the challenges of life in the territory. James was better educated than Beatrice had initially assumed, having attended school in Denver before returning to take over the ranch, and he could hold his own in discussions about books and current events. 3 weeks after her arrival in Trinity, Doc Harrison finally declared Beatrice fully recovered and cleared her to resume normal activities. That evening, James appeared at the hotel with a proposition. "I am driving out to check on a water hole tomorrow morning, early before the heat sets in," he said. "Would you like to come along? It would give you a chance to see some of the country, and it is an easy ride. I will bring that gentle mare I mentioned." Beatrice knew she should probably refuse. Riding out alone with a man she barely knew was hardly proper behavior, and she could imagine what people would say. But she found herself nodding before she could talk herself out of it. "What time? I will pick you up at dawn. Wear practical clothes if you have them, and bring a hat. A real hat, not one of those decorative things city ladies wear." The next morning, Beatrice was waiting in front of the hotel when James arrived leading 2 horses. One was a tall bay gelding that danced sideways, eager to move, and the other was a smaller chestnut mare with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. Beatrice had dressed in her most practical outfit, a simple skirt, a cotton blouse, and boots she had purchased from the mercantile. She had borrowed a wide-brimmed hat from Mrs. Hendricks. "You look like you are ready for an adventure," James said approvingly. He helped her mount, patiently adjusting her stirrups and showing her how to hold the reins. "Her name is Rosie, and she is about the most forgiving horse you could ask for. Just sit deep in the saddle and she will do most of the work." They rode out of town heading southwest, moving at an easy walk that allowed Beatrice to get accustomed to the rhythm of the horse beneath her. The morning air was still relatively cool, and the desert stretched out around them in shades of tan and brown and gray-green, broken by distant purple mountains. The sky was enormous, bigger than any sky Beatrice had ever seen, and she felt simultaneously dwarfed and exhilarated by the vastness of it all. "What do you think?" James asked after they had been riding for about an hour. "It is beautiful," Beatrice said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. "So different from anything I have known, but beautiful in its way. Most people from back east think it is ugly. All they see is dirt and rocks and scrub brush. They are not looking properly. There is beauty in the way the light hits those mountains, in the patterns the shadows make across the sand, in the stubborn way those cactuses survive in such a hostile place." James looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. "You really do see it." They reached the water hole around mid-morning, a natural spring that fed into a shallow basin surrounded by cottonwood trees. It was like an oasis in the desert, a spot of green and coolness in the midst of all that harsh terrain. James checked the water level and the condition of the surrounding area while Beatrice explored, marveling at the way life clustered around this single source of water. "This water hole is the reason my father was able to establish the ranch," James explained as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood, eating the lunch he had packed. "Without reliable water, you cannot run cattle in this country. He fought hard to secure the rights to this land." Are water rights a problem here? They can be. When you have more people than water, conflicts arise. We have been lucky so far, but I know other ranches that have gone under because they lost access to water. Beatrice thought about that, about how different life was here from what she had known. In St. Louis, water came from the tap. She had never had to think about where it came from or whether there would be enough. Everything here is so precarious. One wrong decision, one bad season, and everything could fall apart. That is true of life anywhere, is it not? Nothing is ever really secure. At least here we are honest about it. They talked for hours, the conversation ranging from the practical to the philosophical. James told her about building the ranch, about the satisfaction of seeing cattle thrive on land he had improved, about the loneliness of the work and the bone-deep weariness that came with the constant physical labor. Beatrice told him about her father's death, about the cold reception from her stepmother, about the relief of escaping to a place where she could be useful. "You ever regret coming here?" James asked. Beatrice considered the question seriously. "No, I thought I would, but I do not. I feel more alive here than I ever did in St. Louis. There is something about this place that strips away all the unnecessary things and shows you what really matters." And what really matters, Beatrice Calloway. Work that means something. Relationships built on honesty. The freedom to be yourself without apology. James reached out and took her hand, and the touch sent electricity up her arm. "You are nothing like I expected when I first saw you swaying in that ridiculous dress. What did you expect? A delicate flower who would wilt in the heat and be on the first stage back east. But you are tougher than you look." "I have to be tough. I have no choice." "Everyone has a choice, Beatrice. You chose to stay, to work, to adapt. That takes courage." They rode back to town in the late afternoon, and Beatrice felt sunburned and windblown and completely happy. When James helped her down from the saddle in front of the hotel, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary, and Beatrice felt heat that had nothing to do with the weather. "Thank you for today," she said. "It was wonderful. We should do it again. There is a lot more country to see." "I would like that very much." As the weeks turned into months, Beatrice and James spent more and more time together. He taught her to ride properly, to read the signs of weather in the sky, to identify the plants and animals of the desert. She shared books with him, debated politics and philosophy, helped him with the business side of ranching that he found tedious. They attended church socials together, shared meals at the hotel dining room, took long rides into the desert where they could talk for hours without interruption. The people of Trinity noticed, of course. In a town that small, everyone noticed everything. Some approved of the match, thinking the educated city lady and the successful rancher made a good pair. Others worried that Beatrice was too refined for ranch life, that she would break under the pressure and break James's heart in the process. But James and Beatrice paid little attention to the gossip. They were too absorbed in each other to care what others thought. The mercantile flourished under Beatrice's management. She had a gift for business, for understanding what customers wanted and how to provide it at a fair price. She expanded the store's inventory to include items specifically for the women of the area, things that made their hard lives a little easier or more pleasant. She established credit policies that protected her uncle's interests while still being flexible enough to help families going through rough patches. Within 6 months, the store was not only solvent but actually profitable. Herbert watched his niece's transformation with amazement and delight. The pale, exhausted girl who had fainted in the street had become a confident, capable woman who moved through Trinity like she had been born there. He saw the way James Tucker looked at her, the way she lit up when James entered the store, and he hoped they would be wise enough to see what they had found in each other. It was October, with the brutal heat finally easing into something more bearable, when everything changed. James had invited Beatrice to the ranch for the first time, ostensibly to see the new barn he had just finished building, but really because he wanted her to see his home, the place he had built with his own two hands. The ranch house was larger than Beatrice expected, a solid structure of adobe and wood with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with handmade furniture and colorful Mexican blankets and books lining shelves along one wall. There was a kitchen with a modern cast-iron stove, a sitting room with a fireplace, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. "You built all this yourself?" Beatrice asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of the mantel. "My father started it, but I have added on considerably. It was too big for just one person, but I always hoped I would fill it someday with a family." There was something weighted in his words, something that made Beatrice's heart beat faster. She turned to find James watching her with an expression she had never seen before, vulnerable and open and full of hope. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice was rough, "these past months with you have been the best of my life. I wake up every morning thinking about when I will see you next. You have become essential to me, like water or air. I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "James, I feel the same way. You make me feel safe and challenged and alive all at once. You see me for who I really am, not who I am supposed to be." James closed the distance between them and took both her hands in his. "Then marry me, Beatrice. Be my wife. Help me fill this house with life and laughter and everything it has been missing. I know ranch life is hard, and I know you did not come west looking for a husband, but I swear I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Beatrice said, and the word came out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, James Tucker, I will marry you." James pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Beatrice felt like she was falling again, but this time she knew without question that James would catch her. The kiss was sweet and passionate and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both grinning like fools. They were married 6 weeks later in the Trinity church, with most of the town in attendance. Herbert walked Beatrice down the aisle, beaming with pride, and handed her over to James, who looked stunned by his good fortune. Beatrice wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Hendricks and the other women of Trinity had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that James had picked that morning from the desert. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her with such tenderness that Beatrice felt tears slide down her cheeks. They were happy tears, tears of joy and relief and gratitude for this unexpected life she had found in the most unlikely of places. The wedding celebration was held at the hotel, with food contributed by half the town and fiddle music that kept people dancing until well after midnight. Beatrice danced with James, with her uncle, with ranchers and farmers and shopkeepers who had become friends over the past months. She was welcomed into the community not as an outsider anymore, but as one of their own, as Mrs. Tucker, wife of one of Trinity's most respected citizens. That night, James carried her over the threshold of the ranch house just as he had carried her to Shade that first day, and Beatrice laughed at the parallel. "You seem to make a habit of carrying me places." "I will carry you anywhere you want to go for the rest of our lives," James said, setting her down gently in the bedroom he had prepared for them. He had filled it with candles that cast soft light across the walls, and someone had left wildflowers in a vase on the dresser. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches as they learned each other's bodies and hearts. James was patient and careful, attentive to Beatrice's needs and responses, and Beatrice felt cherished in a way she had never experienced before. They fell asleep tangled together, Beatrice's head on James's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart and thinking that she had never felt so completely at home anywhere in her life. Married life agreed with them both. Beatrice divided her time between the mercantile, where she still helped her uncle manage the business, and the ranch, where she learned the rhythms of cattle and horses and land. She discovered she had a talent for raising chickens and maintaining a vegetable garden, and she took pride in providing fresh eggs and produce for their table. James was endlessly patient as she learned the skills necessary for ranch life, never making her feel inadequate when she failed at something, always celebrating her successes. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. That winter was harsh, with unexpected snowstorms that killed some of their cattle and damaged fences. Beatrice dealt with her first real loneliness during a week when James had to ride out to check on distant pastures, and she was left alone at the ranch. She burned her first attempt at bread so badly the kitchen filled with smoke. She fell off her horse twice and once nearly stepped on a rattlesnake, but through it all, their love deepened and strengthened. They learned to work together, to communicate through difficulties, to support each other through hardships. When spring finally came, and the desert burst into unexpected bloom, covering the brown land with wildflowers in every color imaginable, Beatrice felt like it was a metaphor for their marriage, for the way love could create beauty in the most unlikely places. It was in late spring that Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling James. She chose an evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "James," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, "we are going to have a baby." James stared at her, his expression cycling through shock and disbelief and pure joy. "A baby, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. Doc Harrison confirmed it yesterday." James let out a whoop of joy and pulled Beatrice into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she got dizzy. "We are going to be parents. I am going to be a father. Beatrice, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I am terrified," Beatrice admitted. "I do not know the first thing about being a mother. We will learn together, just like we have learned everything else." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was even worse than usual, and Beatrice struggled with nausea and exhaustion. But James was attentive and supportive, taking over her chores when she was too tired, sitting with her during the worst of the morning sickness, reading to her in the evenings when she was too uncomfortable to move. The women of Trinity rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and stories of their own pregnancies. Mrs. Hendricks taught her to knit and helped her make tiny blankets and hats. The wife of the neighboring rancher showed her how to prepare cloth diapers and set up a nursery. Beatrice was moved by their generosity and support, by the way this community had embraced her as one of their own. Her uncle Herbert was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of becoming a great uncle. He immediately began setting aside the finest toys and baby supplies that came through the mercantile, refusing to let Beatrice pay for any of it. "Family takes care of family," he said firmly. "You took care of me when I needed it. Now let me take care of you." As Beatrice's belly grew, so did her confidence. She might not have been born to this life, but she had chosen it and made it her own. She had found love in the most unexpected way, had built a home and a community in a place that had initially seemed alien and hostile. She had fainted from the heat, yes, but she had also risen stronger from that moment, had let it be the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of something comfortable. On a cold January morning in 1887, with Doc Harrison in attendance and Mrs. Hendricks holding her hand, Beatrice gave birth to a healthy baby boy. James was pacing outside the bedroom door, nearly worn through the floorboards with his nervous energy. And when Doc Harrison finally emerged to tell him he had a son, James burst into the room with such enthusiasm that the doctor had to caution him to be gentle. "He is perfect," James whispered, staring down at the red-faced, squalling infant in Beatrice's arms. "He looks like you." "He looks like an angry old man," Beatrice said, but her voice was full of love. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly during the pregnancy, unable to agree on anything. But now, looking at this tiny person they had created together, James said, "What about Marcus, after your father?" Beatrice felt tears fill her eyes. Her father would have loved this grandchild, would have been so proud to see the life she had built. "Marcus Tucker. It is perfect." Young Marcus proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He thrived in the desert climate, growing fat and happy on his mother's milk and the attention of the entire town of Trinity. James was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, teaching him about the ranch even though Marcus was far too young to understand. Herbert doted on his great-nephew, spoiling him shamelessly with toys and sweets. The mercantile became known for having the best children's goods in the territory, entirely because Herbert insisted on stocking the finest items for his family. Life fell into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before but deeply satisfying. Beatrice learned to juggle the demands of motherhood with her work at the mercantile, though she reduced her hours to focus more on Marcus and the ranch. James hired more help so he could spend more time close to the house, wanting to be present for all the small milestones of his son's early life. 2 years later, Beatrice gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara. She had her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's easy temperament, and she completed their family in a way that felt absolutely right. James built an addition onto the house to give the children their own rooms, and Beatrice taught herself to sew so she could make clothes for her growing family. The years passed in a blur of work and love, and simple domestic happiness. The ranch continued to prosper under James's careful management, and the mercantile became one of the most successful businesses in the territory under Beatrice's guidance. Marcus grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, already learning the business of ranching. Clara was more bookish, preferring to sit with her mother and practice her letters or listen to stories. Trinity grew as well, adding a school and a telegraph office and a second hotel. The railroad came through in 1890, bringing easier access to markets and supplies, but also bringing changes to the character of the town. Some of the old families moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere, but the Tuckers remained, deeply rooted in the land they had claimed and the community they had helped build. It was 5 years after their wedding, on a hot August afternoon very much like the day they had first met, that James suggested they ride out to the water hole where he had first taken Beatrice all those years ago. Herbert agreed to watch the children, and they saddled up the same horses they had ridden that first time, Rosie still patient and steady after all these years. The desert looked much the same as it had that first morning, still harsh and beautiful and vast. But Beatrice was not the same frightened city girl who had fainted in the street, and James was not the bachelor rancher wondering if he would ever find someone to share his life with. They were partners now, husband and wife, parents, business owners, pillars of their community. They sat beneath the same cottonwood tree where they had shared lunch years earlier, and James pulled Beatrice close against his side. "Do you ever miss St. Louis? The culture, the society, the easy life?" Beatrice thought about it honestly before answering. Sometimes I miss certain things. A good bookstore, the theater, the variety of people and ideas, but I would not trade what we have here for anything. This life we have built together means more to me than anything I left behind. You could have married some wealthy merchant back east, had servants and a big house in the city. I married exactly who I was meant to marry. I found exactly the life I was meant to live. That day I fainted in the heat was the best thing that ever happened to me, James Tucker, because it brought you into my life. James turned her face up to his and kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. I caught you once, Beatrice, and I will keep catching you for the rest of our lives. Every time you stumble, every time you fall, I will be there. And I will be there for you. That is what partnership means. They sat together in the shade, talking and dreaming about the future. They wanted more children, maybe one or two more. They talked about expanding the ranch further, about maybe buying the property adjacent to theirs that was coming up for sale. They discussed Marcus's education and Clara's precocious reading ability. They made plans and told stories and simply enjoyed being together, the way they had from the very beginning. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, they mounted their horses and rode back toward home. The ranch house rose out of the desert like a promise kept, windows glowing with lamplight, smoke rising from the chimney where Herbert would be cooking dinner. Beatrice could see Marcus playing in the yard, probably collecting rocks or chasing lizards, and Clara sitting on the porch steps with a book. Home, James said, and the word was full of satisfaction and love. Home, Beatrice agreed, and she marveled at how much that word had come to mean. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children and the endless cycle of work that defined ranch life. Marcus grew into a teenager, tall and strong like his father, already taking on significant responsibilities around the ranch. Clara remained bookish and thoughtful, but she also developed a surprising talent for training horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and intuition. Beatrice's hair began to show threads of silver, and James developed lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun for so many years, but their love remained as strong as ever. They still rode out to the waterhole on their anniversary every year, still talked late into the night on the porch, still looked at each other across crowded rooms and felt that same flutter of attraction and affection. Herbert passed away peacefully in his sleep when Marcus was 15, leaving the mercantile entirely to Beatrice. It was a sad time, but also a celebration of a life well lived. Herbert had been beloved in Trinity, known for his fairness and generosity, and the entire town turned out for his funeral. Beatrice inherited not just his business but his legacy of treating people with dignity and respect. With Herbert gone, Beatrice made the difficult decision to sell the mercantile to a young couple from Colorado who were looking to settle in New Mexico. She kept a financial interest in the business, but she stepped away from daily operations to focus more on the ranch and her family. She was ready for that chapter of her life, to close so a new one could begin. Marcus married at 20 to a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county, a capable young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the Tucker family. They built a house on the far end of the Tucker property and began building their own herd, and Beatrice found herself a grandmother before she turned 40. James took to grandparenthood with enthusiasm, doting on his grandson James Jr. with the same devotion he had shown his own children. Clara showed no interest in marriage, preferring to focus on her work with horses. She became known throughout the territory as a skilled trainer, and people brought their problem horses from as far as Santa Fe for her to work with. James built her a separate stable and training ring, and Clara thrived doing work she loved in a place she loved with family who supported her completely. The turn of the century brought more changes to Trinity and the territory. New Mexico was moving toward statehood, bringing new laws and regulations and opportunities. The Tucker Ranch continued to thrive, now worked by 3 generations of the family. James and Beatrice slowly handed over more and more responsibility to Marcus, while they themselves settled into a gentler rhythm of life. It was on their 25th wedding anniversary that James surprised Beatrice with a gift. He had commissioned a photographer from Santa Fe to come to Trinity, and he arranged for a family portrait to be taken in front of the ranch house. The whole family gathered, James and Beatrice in the center, Marcus and Sarah with little James Jr., Clara with her favorite horse, and even the ranch hands who had been with them for years. The photographer set up his equipment and disappeared beneath his black cloth, and Beatrice felt a wave of emotion as she looked around at everyone gathered there. This family, this life, this home, all of it had grown from that single moment 25 years ago when she had fainted from the heat, and James had caught her. Everything good in her life had flowed from that one moment of vulnerability, that instant when she had been forced to accept help and had found love instead. "What are you thinking about?" James whispered as they waited for the photographer to finish preparing. "About how far we have come. About how grateful I am. Still no regrets, not a single one." The photographer emerged from his cloth and called for everyone to be still. "Hold very steady now, this will take a moment." Beatrice stood in the circle of James's arms, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and the life they had built together, and she smiled for the camera with genuine joy. This was her legacy, her contribution to the world. Not great works of art or literature, not fame or fortune, but this. A family built on love, a ranch carved out of harsh land through hard work, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The years moved on as years do. James developed arthritis that made it harder for him to ride, and Beatrice's eyes weakened until she needed spectacles to read. But they remained active and engaged with the ranch and the family, offering advice and support while letting the younger generation take the lead. Marcus proved to be an excellent rancher, innovative and forward-thinking while still respecting the traditions his father had established. Sarah was beloved by everyone, warm and welcoming, and an excellent mother to their growing brood of children. Clara eventually did marry, choosing a veterinarian from Albuquerque who appreciated her unconventional ways and supported her work with horses. James and Beatrice became great-grandparents, then great-great-grandparents, watching in wonder as the family tree they had started spread and flourished. The original ranch house was expanded several times to accommodate family gatherings, and a tradition developed of everyone coming home for Christmas and for the summer cattle drives. On warm evenings, James and Beatrice would sit on their porch in the rocking chairs James had made for their 15th anniversary, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they loved. They would talk about the past sometimes, remembering their courtship and early marriage, marveling at how young and naive they had been. But mostly they talked about the present, about grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the health of the cattle and the state of the fences, and whether it would rain soon. "Do you remember," Beatrice said one evening when they were both well into their 70s, "how terrified I was that first day? I thought I was dying when I fainted. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even pale as milk and dressed like you were going to a funeral. I was not dressed for a funeral. I was dressed appropriately for a young lady traveling alone. You were dressed like an idiot," James said fondly. All those layers in August in New Mexico. It is a wonder you did not actually die of heat stroke. But you caught me, I did, and you have been catching me ever since. That is my job. That has always been my job." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, rocking gently, the desert cooling around them as night fell. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and closer by, one of the horses nickered softly, the sounds of home familiar and comforting. "I love you, James Tucker," Beatrice said. "I have loved you from almost the first moment we met, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Beatrice Tucker. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, James reached over and took Beatrice's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Their story was not dramatic or extraordinary by any measure except their own. There were no great adventures or heroic deeds, just two people working hard and loving each other, and raising a family and contributing to their community. But it was a good story, a true story, a story of love found and nurtured and allowed to flourish. James Tucker passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Beatrice beside him holding his hand. The entire territory mourned his loss. He had been respected and loved, known for his integrity and his fairness and his devotion to his family. The funeral was held at the Trinity Church where he and Beatrice had married, and it was standing room only, with people spilling out into the churchyard. Beatrice grieved deeply, as one would expect after losing a partner of more than 50 years. But she did not fall apart or lose herself in sorrow. James would not have wanted that. Instead, she focused on the family they had created together, on the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried on the Tucker name and the Tucker legacy. She lived another 5 years after James's death, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She continued to offer advice on the running of the ranch, though Marcus was fully in charge by then. She taught her great-granddaughters to read and her great-grandsons to ride. She sat on her porch in the evenings, remembering her husband and feeling grateful for every moment they had shared. When Beatrice Tucker passed away at the age of 81, she was surrounded by family, holding the hand of her oldest granddaughter. Her last words were a whisper. "Tell your grandfather I am coming. Tell him I am ready for him to catch me again." She was buried beside James on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, beneath a simple stone that read, Beatrice Calloway Tucker, 1865–1946. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she found her home in the desert and love in unexpected places. The Tucker Ranch continued for generations after their deaths, passed down through the family they had created. The story of how it all began, of the city lady who fainted from the heat and the cowboy who caught her and carried her to shade, became a family legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who heard the story never forgot the essential truth at its heart. That love can be found in the most unlikely circumstances. That strength often emerges from moments of weakness. And that home is not a place, but the people you choose to build a life with. The desert remained harsh and beautiful. The sun still beat down with merciless intensity in the summer months, and Trinity continued to grow and change with the times. But the Tucker legacy endured, a testament to two people who had loved each other well and built something that would outlast them both. In a world of constant change and uncertainty, their story remained a beacon of hope, proving that sometimes the best things in life begin with a moment of vulnerability, a helping hand extended, and the courage to fall in love with a place and a person when logic says you should run the other way.